What makes an object valuable to any particular society? What makes these Paracas textiles so valuable in both ancient and modern times? How does extreme labor-intensive work combined with virtuosity in a craft and rarity of a substance produce a valued object? How do value and aesthetics intersect? Andean textiles are the perfect masterpieces of a sophisticated civilization that combined amazing technical virtuosity with supreme aesthetic taste. Yet their technology was simple. It was their labor and the skill that astounds us. In this lecture, we'll look at their examples of what they considered the most prized possessions of the Andean elites. Like the Chinese bronzes of the Shang Dynasty, textiles were deemed the most valuable and prestigious form of art to the ancient Peruvians. Flying south over the coast of Peru, you would be struck by the stark beauty of the coastal desert, one of the driest places on Earth. The most breathtaking view on your flight has to be the Paracas Peninsula, an almost diamond-shaped cliff connected by a thin neck to the mainland. Here, in dry, soaring arches of stone, sea lions gather in barking hordes, and the teeming abundance of bird and ocean life contrasts with the severe emptiness of the sand and the stone. When I first flew over this coastal desert, I could not believe my eyes. It was like the driest, most moon-like landscape I had ever seen. It looked like no living thing could survive on the land there. Yet it was here that the ebullient ancient Andean culture of Paracas buried masses of their dead, and the full splendor of their textile artworks were discovered by Julio Tello in 1925. A whole necropolis, an underground city of Paracas people buried for over 2 millennia, began to reveal their bundled secrets buried in the sand. Snippets of elaborately woven and colored tapestries had been showing up for a number of years before, so archaeologists had become curious and began to excavate. They found the spectacular and very unusual remains of a culture, 429 mummy bundles swathed in stunning textiles. These textiles were true artworks, so alive with color and motion, rhythm and personality that it was surprising to behold. This was Paracas. Like the Egyptians, the people here on the Peruvian coast noticed that the dry sands admirably preserved buried bodies and their grave goods and accoutrements. And like the Egyptians, they elaborately wrapped their mummies, winding them in cloth. But the type of cloth was quite different. In Egypt, it was more practical, usually a plain linen with the focus on the goods that accompanied the mummy to the grave. In contrast, in the Paracas burials, the mummies of high-status people were wrapped in layers of garments so sumptuous and woven in such complex techniques that modern weavers can only marvel at their virtuosity. In some cases, they cannot even replicate the techniques they used. And luckily for us, the dry, hot climate of the Paracas Peninsula preserved these textiles so that we can see an amazing number of them today. The Paracas culture thrived in the south coast areas of Peru from about 700 BC to 200 AD. It was known for its weirdly haunting ceramics with somewhat demonic-looking animals like smiling felines. But it was in their weavings that the Paracas people expressed their ideas to a much fuller extent. The ritual garments reflected Paracas religion, a shamanistic tradition, and the natural world in which they lived. In shamanism, a fantastic spirit world exists and can be reached by people in altered states of consciousness. The textiles display a riot of 19 bright colors, yellows, reds, blues, and greens, that burst forth from the cloths and were used in syncopated designs. These designs are provoking to the senses and enigmatic to decipher. Paracas weavers depicted a number of powerful animals, along with strangely contorted figures composed of birds, monkeys, snakes, puma, and even shark parts. These had strange streamers emanating like tongues from their bodies. At the end of these streamers, you usually find dangling trophy heads. What does this all mean? Why were hundreds of mummy bundles wrapped in these sumptuous cloths buried in the remote and wild desert coast? Well, these cloths represented an important form of wealth to the Paracas people in the burials and to all Andean people in general. Using only backstrap looms or upright looms for tapestry, groups of Andean women were devoted to spinning, dyeing, and weaving complex cloths. Later in Peruvian history, chosen women were even sequestered as prisoners in convent-like buildings in order to devote themselves to weaving for the elites, the emperor, and the sun god. Here you see an illustration from a 1615 or 16 manuscript created by an indigenous noble, Guaman Poma de Ayala, who chronicled life in Peru before and after conquest. He was complaining of Spanish injustices. We learn a great deal about life before the Spanish conquest from his documents and its drawings. Here you see he's even depicted the Inca chosen women, the Aclacuna, who are spinning wool as they are directed by their abbess. Labor-intensive weavings with so many people involved in their making were not only valuable goods, however. They communicated values and religious ideas with their symbols, ideas that were important to the group. Garments that you wear, of course, communicate information about your status, your wealth, your gender, and beliefs. Just think of the Queen of England in a golden brocade dress, complete with her crown, elaborate jewelry, a scepter, and a large retinue. Not only do these garments show wealth and power, they also often make the wearer look larger and more imposing. They are often shiny and they reflect light, making the wearer a focus of attention. So textiles were and are important quite beyond what we often think. In ancient times, in societies that took the form of chiefdoms or early states, sumptuous wear was very important to communicate these messages of status and exclusivity. In fact, most societies around the world had what we call sumptuary laws, laws that restrict certain garments, colors, designs, or accessories to a ruling class. For instance, the Inca emperor and his retinue were the only ones allowed to wear vicuña garments. A vicuña was the member of the camelid family, which had by far the softest wool. The Inca emperor was even noted for having a garment made entirely of bat skins. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in Peru in the 1500s, the first gifts they received from the Inca were intricately woven textiles. Of course, the Spanish sought gold, but this cloth was considered more valuable to the Andean civilizations. Textiles like this one were a form of wealth, as valuable as gold in many ancient Andean societies. In the ancient Andean societies of Peru, textiles played an enormously important role and were highly valued as luxury commodities. The weaving process was laborious and difficult, and women were highly trained and devoted to the craft. I learned to weave in high school and found the preparatory aspects laborious, difficult, and in some respects tediously mathematical. The reward came only when you were able to reach the exciting part of sending the shuttle through the warp and creating an actual design on the fabric. The weavers expressed many of the most important ideas of the society in the textiles they wove: myths, religious concepts, social hierarchy, and forces of nature, along with humans, animals, and supernaturals were represented. What kind of world encouraged the growth of this craft to such a highly sophisticated and expressive level? What natural resources are necessary to spark this concern with beautiful woven cloth and tapestry? Well, first of all, let's look to the plants and animals that provided the raw material for the cloth. Cotton is native to Peru and one of the first plants to be exploited by the early inhabitants of the coast. One of the earliest forms of technology known from the area is the twining of cotton fibers to make nets in order to catch fish. Additionally, the Andes were home to hordes of llamas, alpacas, vicuñas, and guanacos, the camelid family of mammals, and the largest mammals in the mountains. Llamas and alpacas were domesticated and exploited as beasts of burden, and their soft wool was used for fine garments like this sweater of alpaca that I'm wearing. There's nothing as soft as a baby alpaca sweater, unless, of course, it's a vicuña one. So, with the harsh landscape, the glaciers of the high mountains, the teeming life of the cold sea, and the hot coastal desert in between, Andean groups had to think collectively and act in the interests of the group for survival in these marginal lands. Their societies were tightly organized for the common good and had to undertake projects like irrigation canals and trading reciprocal goods between regions in order to survive. Textiles were one important good that was traded or given as gifts. Weaving was extremely labor-intensive. Making elaborate cloth meant that some people had to grow cotton, others had to herd the alpacas and llamas, and yet others had to grow plants and dye the thread that was spun. Some of the weavings from Paracas were enormous. One was 85 feet long, and textiles in just one mummy bundle could take from 5,000 to 29,000 hours of work to create. So cooperation was key to survival, and a complex hierarchy of workers served to further the goals of the group. In the Andean artworks such as pottery and weavings, that social structure of extreme cooperation was reflected with an emphasis on supernatural creatures and abstract forms. This differed from the Olmec or the Egyptians, whose cultures emphasized portraits or specific artifacts that identified a person. It was the role of a person, priest, ruler, worker, etc., that was important. The individual identity, not so much. So this Paracas culture focuses on group identity with some degree of standardization in its artwork. Weaving is perfect for this approach with its rectilinear grid and repetitive patterns. It's also quite different from what we're used to, like European portraits or ruler statues or other individualized monuments. Here, forces of nature and spiritual transformative powers are king. So, armed with this worldview, Paracas people and Andean culture in general emphasized cycles of life and death, supernatural creatures, and shamans and priests who impersonated powerful animals. They wrapped high-status people in these beautiful cloths when they died, which indicated their roles in both life and in death. Let's look at one of these mummy bundles and see what they put together. Let's start with the body itself. The corpse was tied with ropes into a seated fetal position. You can think of the body in this position as a seed, a fetus or kernel waiting to be reborn. Offerings like shells, animal hides, feathers, staffs, and perhaps some gold ornaments like nose rings were placed on the body and around it. The body was then seated in a basket. Layers of the elaborate cloths were then wound around it as if it were a bobbin for weaving. Some mummies were found with as many as 44 fancy embroidered cloths wound around them, and 25 plain cloths as well. So a mummy bundle could be as much as 7 feet high and almost as wide. The bundle of cloth, some of which consisted of matching sets of mantles and loincloths, indicated that the person was important and gave clues to his or her role. These clothes were like the husk around a seed, and the kernel of the body within was expected to be reborn in the Paracas conception. Let's now look at some of the designs that are embroidered on these mantles. They offer clues to the roles and the religious beliefs of the Paracas people. The most spectacular mantle, in my opinion, is this one in Boston. It is completely and astonishingly alive. The mantle consists of a red field with a very clear and colorful set of embroidered motifs arranged in a checkerboard-like pattern. We see a series of strange, bent-back figures in brilliant colors, very distinct from the bright red background and the black border. Each one's color scheme varies from the one next to it, but the effect is controlled, not chaotic. These figures are not static either, but dynamic, curving, and almost dancing with glee, it seems. They're thought to be shamans, spiritual specialists who enter a trance and visit the spirit world transformed into animal-human hybrids. Shamans perform cures and can assure the fertility of the land. Shamans were key to the mystical religious traditions of the Andes, and we've seen them before in the Maya world, Siberia, and many other places. Shamans like these are often shown dancing while in a trance state, frequently after having consumed hallucinogenic substances like mushrooms. They reached altered states by other means too, pain and self-mutilation, as you saw with the Maya, and hunger, bloodletting, and alcohol. These shamanic figures are not confined to a single direction, color, or identical appearance. They are rhythmically opposed, not entirely symmetrical, and yet extremely pleasing in their all-over pattern of flying, wiggling dynamism. There are even some mistakes in the pattern. What, though, are they actually doing? Some interpret these figures as bent-back, bearded shamans with hair streaming free. They're holding hallucinogenic mushrooms in their hands, which they have clearly just consumed. The freedom and electric activity, along with their strange smiling and impossible postures, give some credence to this. Another interpretation of the figures says that they are actually self-sacrificing, ripping their own hearts out of their chests where a little box represents the whole, and the object they hold is the heart shaped like a fan. They are in the process of dying, which is represented by the bent back posture. Interpreting these figures is of course difficult and perhaps never to be entirely resolved. However, the pleasure of the pattern, the colors, the riot of intense movement, all repeated in a painstaking embroidery technique demanding huge outlays of labor and non-efficient approaches to production. All that is astonishing and very different from how we look at art today. Another design one sees in Paracas, which harks back to the theme of sacrifice and trophy heads and veers away from the personal or entirely human, is the image of bird impersonators or shamans who have monkey-like feet, snake staffs, and trophy head patterns. The motif of the trophy head and blood, liquid substances of life, is particularly emphasized in Andean art. We've seen actual trophy heads as well as representations of them on ceramics, textiles, and on stone. If we look at a tunic that was created a bit later, circa 600 AD, we see an equally dazzling but quite different approach to textile design. This tapestry tunic was far more than a piece of men's clothing. It was most likely a statement of religious and political control. It manipulated images for that purpose. The culture which created it, called the Wari, was a Peruvian highland-based empire with a highly organized and strict state exerting extreme economic and social control. It flourished during its height in the 6th to 8th centuries AD. Wari art and architecture were bold, based on a rigid, rectilinear grid, and proclaimed their militaristic and organized character. This characteristic of control is reflected in the textiles, which are considered some of the finest weavings in the world. They used extraordinarily fine wool, alpaca and llama, which could have meant that one tunic incorporated as much as 6 to 9 miles of yarn. Additionally, the very geometric, abstract forms look almost modern. These textiles, in fact, influence modernist painting. I certainly think of Mondrian or Paul Klee every time I look at this. The illegible patterns on the tunics confound modern viewers into thinking that they are abstract. But if you look deeper and examine the patterns, there are images abstracted from real things related to the religion. The religious ideas were propagated by the textiles and spread across the empire. Some Wari religious rituals involve the consumption of chicha, corn beer, which may have been laced with hallucinogens. While these aren't precisely hallucinogenic images, they are repetitive patterns, esoteric ones, that hide actual motifs that represent gods and animals. Let's look more closely at this tunic. Wari weavers used the tapestry technique, which is extremely time-consuming and exact. It involves interlocking threads. They also utilize bright but limited colors and a limited number of geometric patterns. The tunic was the main form of textile, and the cloth was never cut, just slipped on through the neck slit. That slit was created because generally the tunic was woven with 2 separate sections that were then sewn together, leaving a gap where the head would poke through. It could also be woven in as a slit. It covered the wearer in a manner that made him look as if he were a walking banner, with visual information readily telegraphed for those who saw him. And what did it say? The Lima tapestry, as this is called, and many other Wari tunics, use a series of repeated figures that have been distorted in such a way as to render them almost illegible. The figure they show the most is the staff bearer, an image known from the earliest cults of Peru. It's usually seen as a running or kneeling figure holding a staff upright. It can be humanoid or an animal or some hybrid. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly what it means or the story in which it appears, but it would have been well known to all who lived at the time of its making. It appears most notably on the gateway to the sun at Tiwanaku, Bolivia, in a frontal stance, like this. The Wari weavers take this image, conceptually place it into the grid formed by warp and weft, and then they break it apart into rectilinear segments. They then distort it by making vertical sections of it very, very narrow and others quite wide. But the whole design is there. Towards the outer edge of the tunic, the design is most contracted and most expanded in the center. Interestingly, this serves to make the wearer of the tunic look larger towards the middle and perhaps overall more imposing. Each repeated figure of the design is slightly different. The Wari weavers didn't like exact copies or total standardization. For each figure, the colors vary, the individual parts are proportioned differently, and occasionally there is a pop that gives a bit of surprise to the pattern. The Wari Lima tapestry, for instance, makes use of a few areas of an unusual blue and even a pink. The tunic is also divided by broad red vertical bands. The staff-bearer motifs are almost impossible to read as an actual design. It's become an almost completely abstract work of art now, but those who understood the religion and its iconography got the message. What's marvelous about this is that despite its rhythmic, abstract vitality, it actually functions as an encoded document of religious belief and probably status for the wearer. The trend over time here in the Andes, then, is towards ever greater abstraction in the textile arts. The Inca Empire carried this to its extreme, not only in textiles but in its stonework as well. It had some of the most abstract, nature-oriented symbols and works, devoid of any figures. Here's a very important, beautiful, and rare example of an Inca royal tunic. Now, the Inca came to their greatest power in the 15th century AD, expanding an empire which extended from approximately Quito in Ecuador, about 3,000 miles, to past Santiago, Chile. It was perhaps the largest empire in the world at the time. The empire, which did not use writing as we understand it, instead used a unique knotted device called a quipu to record information. Inca art that remains today is spare, beautiful, and it has a completely different aesthetic than, say, the art of Mesoamerica or Europe. It is mostly extremely abstract, and the Inca are most remembered for their magnificent and unparalleled stonework, perhaps the greatest in the world. But they considered their most precious commodity to be their sumptuous textiles. The most precious textiles were given as gifts by the emperor to reward his subjects, and they were the most finely woven and decorated cloths. Textiles were also burned as offerings or buried with the dead. This tunic belonged to a royal Inca, possibly the emperor himself, since it is unique and unparalleled in design. It's so finely and tightly woven that there are around 100 weft threads per centimeter. As you can see here, the tunic is composed of an all-over design of numerous square motifs arranged on a grid. These colorful individual designs are called tokapu, and only nobles were allowed to wear them. This is the only garment known today where the tokapu motifs completely cover it. We only have others with just a few bands of tokapu on a tunic. The tokapu motifs all had meaning, much of which is lost to us today. But, for instance, this tokapu has repeated on it this vivid design of a tunic with a red neck bib and black and white checkerboard patterns. This is a military tunic design. It's repeated numerous times here. Perhaps the profusion of tokapu designs here reflected the fact that the emperor held sway over all the people and things in his empire. Each tokapu had meaning that we no longer possess. What an extraordinary message this garment sent. It could be read by all the Inca emperor's subject as if it were a form of writing. We at least can appreciate its unparalleled skill, beauty, and understand it as a way of communicating power, prestige, and wealth. What's so striking about the Andean textiles, and particularly the Inca phase, is this. At least 500 years before we in the Western cultural tradition thought of abstract art as a new and exciting development, an arcane and gorgeous form of abstraction was developed here in the Andes. They were quite isolated from all other civilizations on Earth, and yet the Andes produced sophisticated, abstract concepts and were virtuosos of many different forms of art. My professor at Columbia, Esther Pastori, has recently written a book entitled Inca Cubism, which illustrates this tunic on its cover. It is the premier example of a masterpiece of abstraction. It exemplifies the Andean and particularly the Inca worldview. Man is not the center of the cosmos, and they chose to understand the world and explain it in abstract and geometric artworks. That is very different from the works we have looked at from the ancient Near East, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, and even Mesoamerica. The Inca Empire was extremely ordered and bureaucratic. It was organized differently from the market economies and conquest states we know in most other parts of the world. So it is fascinating for us to see that only in the last decades of the 20th century, with the increasing appreciation of cubism and abstraction, have the Andean arts come into their own.